Hello and welcome to my world. It's been a while since I've done a commentary video on this YouTube channel of mine, but considering how often I am being pestered with creator notice, encouraging emails from YouTube, I figured, okay, let me try and come up with a commentary video every now and then. So I'll try to make these more reoccurring than I have, which have been virtually non-existent any which way. Recently, I completed a playthrough of The Last of Us Remastered for the PlayStation 4. Why the PlayStation 4 version? Because I don't have a PlayStation 5, and even if I did, I would not pay $70 for a fucking second remaster of a game that originally came out on the PlayStation 3. So thankfully, when I got my PS4, back in it would have been 2021. I got it, I think, or was it 2020, one or the other. It came with The Last of Us Remastered but bundled in, so it kind of came as like a group thing there. Now the thing is, always heard about The Last of Us and its reputation as being an all-time great video game. So it's like, okay, it ended up being on my list as a game. Okay, I want to play it. I want to experience it from a casual gamer standpoint. I want to be able to enjoy the story, the visuals, and hey, actually maybe put some dent on my PlayStation Trophy achievement list of things there. And boy, oh boy, did many of those things were not positive in any shape, way, or form. Again, this is my perspective on it, uh, from my one and what will be my only playthrough of The Last of Us in any shape, way, or form. Visually, I found it to be a pretty looking game 80% of the time. Anytime when you was outdoors, you had the bright sunshine and so forth in many areas of the game, and the game looks absolutely gorgeous. The biggest problem is when you go, well, at least visually for me, going into the darkened areas was very limited to low lighting. You're relying on the flashlight, and it just looks like gray soup. It looks it looks fucking awful to me visually in terms of being able to see what the hell I'm supposed to be looking at. And keep in mind, played I play every single game on the same kind of monitor and so forth. And I had some flashbacks actually while playing The Last of Us Remastered to stuff from the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 era. Mostly the PS2 era, where there were some games that had like a dark and limited lit areas. And a great example would, for me, visually would be, because I did mess around with it earlier this year, was the PS2 version for Resident Evil Code Veronica. And how the start of that game just looks like a dark, bleak mess, and I can barely see a damn thing in certain areas towards the start of that game. and and so I'm thinking, okay, so this is the remastered version of a game that came out on the PlayStation 3. Why is some of these dark areas looking as bad, if not worse, than a game that was ported to the PlayStation 2 a good, what, 15 years prior, give or take? So there's that little aspect of it that makes me go, it's like, no, I don't want to go through that visual experience ever again, no matter how good the game looks the rest of the time. And another big area where I have that problem, same problem is if you is when the areas where you have the spores, where Joel has to put on the gas mask. There's like two major areas with that where it just looks awful. One is when you escape with Ellie. It's like the first real time where you have to swim for find a board to get her from one part to another. So it's like the spores in the area combined with the water and how the what light was there reflecting just looked it just looked bad to me. Then we'll get to the controls. Now I fully get and understand. So I say controls, I also mean gameplay. I fully get and understand that Joel is supposed to be presented as someone who is not clearly not in his physical prime, clearly not trained for combat. However, those two things kind of go out the window when it's established that this dude is supposed to be a smuggler of sorts and that he's supposed to be able to take care of himself. So even after 10 to 15 years from when the in-game pandemic started to where we get that time skip and so forth, that you will be able to use him as somebody who's experienced in living in the world that he is in. And with how he moves and in combat situations, it just comes across as just being slow and clunky. And I find myself actually think about it as like, where have I experienced something like that before? And the closest things that come to mind are the characters of Sebastian Lockpuncher Castellanos in The Evil Within and Alan Wake in Alan Wake. And then, but I can't help but feel that in those two games, it was actually more justified to some degree. I mean, with The Evil Within, you are encouraged to take your time with Sebastian because there are numerous hazards, even when you're not in combat, that you have to deal with to various degrees. And in Alan Wake, you have someone who is just who's an author who is clearly not physically uh in physical condition being able to deal with the situations that he's in that game. Uh, then you have Joel, character who's okay. He's not a cop like Sebastian, but he's clearly would have a lot more experience and would be in notably better condition than Alan. So it's like he's kind of falls into that weird middle ground as the protagonist in terms of how he moves and how you control him. It also doesn't help that the control layouts of item switching I felt was extremely awkward as well in The Last of Us. It just didn't it didn't really click with me until maybe 3/4 of the way through the game when right about when Ellie becomes playable for a reasonable portion of the game, that the controls actually made sense where I'm not like second guessing switching between things every so often. And lastly, and this is probably my biggest gripe, is the story. I looked it up. The Last of Us originally released on the PlayStation 3 about a year after The Walking Dead Season 1 by Telltale Games released or started its episodic releases. And I can't help but compare the two games in terms of how it's presenting the characters. And so it's basically Joe and Ellie versus Clementine and Lee at this point. And no, it's probably a very unfair comparison for the most part because you know what, Lee and Clementine are actually likable for for the majority of the time. You are actually encouraged to want to, as Lee in The Walking Dead, to look out for Clementine, try to instill in her the right values and so forth. The Last of Us, basically Joel could give two shits about Ellie until he starts projecting his own issues onto her, as it relates to how he lost his daughter at the very beginning of the game. So there's that big cross and contrast there. It's like, okay, very different character motivations and so forth here. Ellie is tolerable. It does become fairly likable at times, but doesn't really have any real charm or anything that's memorable about her. Uh, Matter of fact, the most fascinating character in the game, I think there was called was Tess, and they're basically used as justification for Joel escorting Ellie 3/4 of the way across the country. I found the ending of The Last of Us to be rather self-indulging. That okay, this is a guy who has so many issues that he had just one job, and Ellie, well, at least from my perspective, doesn't really look at him as a parent, as though okay, it's a father-like figure, but it's it's really made clear that Ellie knows what her fate is supposed to be, and Joel basically makes her life meaningless with his own selfish decision. It probably would not bother me as much if it was given more as a choice instead of something that was predetermined outright. Now, I don't know if they had the idea for a sequel in mind, but well, clearly they didn't, based on the reaction a lot of people got to The Last of Us Part Two, which I haven't played yet. But I will. I do intend to play that just to see if the hate towards that game is actually justified. If anything, from what I've seen, The Last of Us Part Two tries to make up for the very shitty ending of The Last of Us. So at some point, I'm looking forward to see that. But in terms of wanting to play this again, nope, not at all. So there you go. Those are my reasons, mine alone, my justification for never wanting to play The Last of Us ever again, no matter what version of it comes out. I will say this though: if they actually go out of the way to release a version that actually has decent gameplay, decent controls, and a tells the story, want to take another crack at redoing that story and do it better to try and justify Joel's actions, okay, I'll give that a shot, but not certainly a remaster of a PlayStation 3 release. So can't imagine how many times this game is going to get remastered. It's going to get remastered for the PlayStation 6 in about 5 to 7 years. Knowing Sony, probably. Anyway, thank you very much for indulging me. Talk to you later. Bye.